Hi, and welcome to today's Daily Chronicle. Today is Wednesday, September 10th, 2025. Trump administration cancels $679 million for offshore wind projects at ports. Ports around the country are vying to become hubs of 4 offshore wind farms, like the State Pier in New London, which is supplying the South Fork Wind Farm offshore. The Trump administration is canceling $679 million in federal funding for ports to support the country's offshore wind industry. The latest move in President Trump's ongoing campaign against wind power. Offshore wind is still a developing industry in the US. While Europe already has thousands of wind turbines in deep ocean waters, those offshore turbines are dramatically larger than the ones on land and require substantial infrastructure at ports for construction. From large assembly facilities to deep water docks for ships that carry out turbines out to sea. Ports around the country hoped to seize the economic opportunity to become hubs for the wind industry. Under the Biden administration, 12 port projects from California to Virginia were granted funds, all of which the Trump administration said on Friday was either withdrawing or canceling. Wasteful wind projects are using resources that could otherwise go towards revitalizing America's maritime industry. U.S. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy said in announcing the decision. He said if possible, the funding could be redirected to address critical port upgrades. Representative Jared Huffman, Democrat from California, who represents an area that lost funding, said in a statement, "This is a new level of idiocracy, where the Trump administration is trying to destroy an entire sector of clean energy, kill thousands of good-paying jobs, and drive up electricity prices for American consumers." Just over a week ago, the Trump administration ordered wind companies to stop construction on a wind farm off the Rhode Island coast. Trump is a longtime critic of wind power, claiming it's expensive and kills birds. He has pushed for cuts to tax incentives for wind and solar, which analysts have shown could raise electricity prices around the country. The wind industry is reeling from the recent decisions, a marked change from a few years ago when the growing demand for electricity spurred a surge in announcements for new wind projects. The federal Trump administration ran on rebuilding back America, building infrastructure, creating U.S. jobs, creating manufacturing. This project that does all of that, says Chris Mickelson, executive director of the Port of Humboldt Bay, one of the ports that had its project funding canceled, bringing industry to a rural port. The federal grants were directed at creating wind manufacturing and logistics hubs, including in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Staten Island in New York. The project that took the biggest hit is in Humboldt Bay in Northern California, which is losing out on more than $426 million. The port is located on a rural part of the state. 5 hours north of San Francisco. For decades, it supported the local timber industry, which has waned significantly over the years. In 2022, the federal government held the first offshore lease for wind power in California, a sign the industry would be poised to take off. Mickelson says it represents a huge economic opportunity for his area. It's the biggest we've seen in the century. There's no doubt about it. Mickelson said, "We're not talking about entry-level jobs. These are very skilled, very high-paying jobs here in Humboldt County are in desperate need." The federal grant represented a significant part of funded needing for the Humboldt Bay offshore wind heavy lift marine terminal project, which would also leverage private and state investment. The port planned to use it to clean up and remediate polluted areas, building facilities for handling the turbine parts, dredge the waterway, and build a larger wharf capable of handling pieces of steel longer than a football field. With the funding cancellation, Mickelson says he hopes it's just a pause for the project. Since California continues to push for renewable energy, the state has a goal of getting 100% of its electricity from zero carbon sources by 2045. Offshore wind power is particularly useful for the state because it produces at night, when solar power goes away. This hurts a little bit, but it doesn't change our focus. It certainly doesn't change our outcome, Mickelson said. An administration can't change the fact that the U.S. has incredible energy demands. Turmoil for the wind industry. Electricity demand is growing across the country, especially as new data centers are built for artificial intelligence. Solar and wind projects produce cheaper energy, on average, than fossil fuels projects that run on natural gas and coal, though the cost can vary greatly depending on the location and type of project. The Biden administration set a goal of getting 30 gigawatts of power from offshore wind by 2030, enough for around 10 million homes. An analysis found that the plan could create 77,000 jobs, according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, a federal research lab. President Trump put out a moratorium of the development of new offshore wind projects on his first day in office. In canceling the Rhode Island wind project, the administration stated it was for the protection of national security interests, but did not elaborate on what those are specifically. "We're not allowing any windmills to go up," Trump said earlier this week, "unless there's a legal situation where somebody committed to it a long time ago. We don't allow windmills." More than 80 gigawatts of offshore wind projects have been planned in the U.S., but their future has gotten murkier. Interest rates have gone up, making financing more challenging. Turmoil in the industry could also make it harder to attract investment. Many companies are hoping it's a passing phase, given the overall demand for electricity. We will have an offshore wind industry in this country because it's hard to imagine we can bring the kind of power we need to the coasts without it, said Jason Grummett, Chief Executive Officer of the American Clean Power Association, a renewable energy industry group. But at the moment, the industry is very worried because projects are being canceled with virtually no rationale. 4 people and 5 months in space. NASA's Crew 10 mission safely returns to Earth. From left, NASA's SpaceX Crew 10 members Kirill Peskov of Roscosmos, NASA astronauts Nicole Ayers and Anne McClain, and JAXA, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, astronaut Takuya Onishi posed for a group portrait inside the International Space Station's Kibo laboratory module on July 19th, 2025. A crew of 4 wrapped up a nearly 5-month stay on the International Space Station, splashing down on the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California under a canopy of parachutes Saturday. In the same SpaceX capsule that launched NASA's Crew 10 mission to the station back in March. It took the capsule about 17 hours to make the trip home, experiencing the re-entry temperatures of around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit as it punched through the atmosphere following Friday's undocking with the ISS. The crew of NASA's astronauts, Anne McClain and Nicole Ayers, Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, JAXA, astronaut Takuyo Onushi, and Russia's Roscosmos cosmonaut Kirill Peskov spent their time on the station conducting more than 200 space experiments that helped prepare humans for exploration beyond low Earth orbit that included material studies and experiments to better understand psychological, physiological, and psychological changes to the human body. We got a lot to accomplish. A lot of really amazing operational things. We got to see some amazing news, and we have had some really big belly laughs and a wonderful time together, said NASA Nicole Ayers, the mission's pilot. It was the first space mission for Ayers and fellow crewmate Peskov. It was the second trip to the station for McClain and Onoshi. The replacements, Crew 11, arrived at the station a week ago. NASA astronauts Zena Cardiman and Mike Fink, along with JAXA astronaut Kimiya Yui and Russian cosmonaut Oleg Platonov, will spend roughly 6 months on the orbiting lab conducting space experiments and maintenance. That mission marked the 12th time SpaceX launched NASA astronauts to the ISS. In 2020, the private company began ferrying astronauts to the station as part of the agency's commercial crew program, ending a reliance on Russia for rides to the station after the retirement of the space shuttle program in 2011. There has been a continual human presence on the space station since October 31st, 2000. But NASA and its international partners plan to retire the ISS around the end of the decade. NASA is hoping commercial companies will launch new space stations for the agency's astronauts in the coming decade. All of us are keenly aware that we may never get to do this again, said McClain, Crew 10 commander, before her departure. We've been very pensive over the last days of understanding what we have all got to be a part of. The MAHA plan for healthier kids includes 128 ideas, but few details. U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. presented a strategy report of the Make America Healthy Again Commission, intended to tackle childhood chronic disease. The Trump administration released a report Tuesday outlining a broad strategy to improve children's health. It calls for a wide range of executive actions and policy reforms aimed at tackling a rise in chronic disease. In announcing the report, Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. called chronic disease in kids an existential crisis for our country, and said the report's 128 recommendations are historic and unprecedented. There's never been an effort like this across all government agencies, he said. The Make America Healthy Again Commission, led by Kennedy, identified 4 potential drivers behind rising rates of chronic disease among children, including poor diet, chemical exposure, lack of physical activity, and chronic stress, as well as medicalization, which the Commission describes as a concerning need, as a concerning trend of overprescribing medications to children. The report has drawn mixed reactions from researchers and advocates working in public health, who note that its goals stands at odds with other recent Trump administration motives. Those include funding cuts to food assistance, Medicaid programs, and scientific research, as well as Secretary Kennedy's push for changes in vaccine policy, all of which could undermine public health. How can we make America healthy again unless we renew our commitment to ensuring access to food for children and other Americans, asks Eric Mitchell, president of the Alliance to End Hunger, in a statement? Well, administration officials regularly tout at the importance of nutrition. They worked with Congress to pass a plan that will push millions of people off federal food assistance, known as SNAP, he says. Susan Main, an epidemiologist at Yale University School of Public Health and former Food and Drug Administration official, says there's consensus that we need to address chronic disease in our whole population, including children. And she agrees now is the time to take action. The Maha report includes a lot of good talk about things they want to do, Main says. But the plan for how to execute it and the resources for how to get that done are actually going in the opposite direction. And so that concerns me. Tackling kids' diet and exercise habits. The report notes that 60% of the calories U.S. children consume come from highly processed foods, which often contain excess salt, refined starch, and sugar. It calls for an educational campaign to promote the government's dietary guidelines, which are expected to be updated in the coming weeks. The campaign will emphasize eating more whole foods and less highly processed products. Maine says it's a good idea to develop a standard definition for ultra-processed foods, but says we need more than a definition. What are the steps that we're going to take so that they're eating less of it? She wonders, there are steps that they should be taking immediately to continue to try to reduce things like excess sodium, excess sugar, and excess saturated fat in those ultra-processed foods. The strategy calls for new research into nutrition and chronic disease, prevention, and the development of a standard definition of ultra-processed foods. It says the government will remove restrictions on whole milk, sales in schools, and help states limit the purchase of unhealthy items with SNAP benefits. The Maha Commission points to unprecedented levels of inactivity among children, and their strategy calls for partnering with the President's Council on Sports, Fitness, and Nutrition, and promote more physical activity in after-school programs. In addition, the plan is to launch an education and awareness initiative on screen time, one of the causes of inactivity, which will be led by a Surgeon General. To date, the Trump administration has not appointed a Surgeon General. It has nominated Casey Means. I'm very happy to see that they've identified diet and physical activity as two of the top health problems in the U.S., says Lindsay Smith-Talley, professor of nutrition at the Gilling School of Public Health at UNC Chapel Hill. But this report was lacking actual meaningful action that would help Americans address our problems. Chemical exposure flagged, but little pressure on pesticides. An earlier Maha report released in May pointed to potential harms of chemical exposure and noted that children can be more vulnerable to these harms. It listed a range of chemicals, including PFAS, phthalates, biphenyls, microplastics, and chemical used on farms to kill pests and weeds. The new strategy report states that children are exposed to an increasing number of synthetic chemicals, some of which have been linked to developmental issues and chronic disease. This is an issue that has animated parts of the Maha movement. As a long-time environment lawyer, Kennedy has spoken out frequently against the use of agricultural pesticides and herbicides. During the 2024 presidential campaign, he made statements vowing to ban some agricultural chemicals that are already restricted in other countries. But the report calls for huge changes on a regulation of pesticides. The strategy calls for a more status quo approach to evaluate current regulations. That govern the use of agricultural chemicals. The current regulatory framework should be continually evaluated to ensure that chemical and other exposures do not interact together to pose a threat. Dr. Philip J. Langredon, a pediatrician and professor at Boston College and director of the Program for Global Health and the common good, notes that the report contains no recommendations on how to reduce children's exposure to toxic chemicals in food, other than food dyes and heavy metals in instant formula. A call for a new vaccine framework. The strategy also calls on the White House, Domestic Policy Council, and HHS to develop a new vaccine framework, which may mean revamping the vaccine schedule, the list of vaccinations that children should receive at specific ages. The schedule is developed by infectious disease experts and a committee of expert advisors to the CDC, a group that Kennedy recently replaced with his own, picks including some critical of vaccines. The strategic plan calls for addressing vaccine injuries and ensuring medical freedom, which in this context could suggest support for giving people more personal choice over vaccinating their children. Kennedy's recent moves in the area raised concerns that further actions may undermine an evidence-backed, uniform approach to vaccination. He recently pushed out Centers for Disease Control and Prevention Director Susan Monarez and put new limits on access to the COVID vaccine. In a Senate hearing with Kennedy last week, Senator Patty Murray, Democrat from Maine, called for the immediate firing of Kennedy, saying this man is burning down our public health system from the inside. This administration's unprecedented cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, along with its chaotic, confusing actions restricting vaccines access, are worsening. Not resolving efforts to improve children's health, said Dr. Susan J. Cressley, president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. A wide mix of ideas. All told, the report contains 128 proposals, covering research, policy changes, and regulation, public awareness campaigns, and suggestions for public-private partnerships. But Landrigan of Boston College says it fails to present any kind of comprehensive blueprint for improving the health of American children. Overall, I would describe the report as representing a very uneven, poorly conceived, disjointed hodgepodge of recommendations that reflect Secretary Kennedy's preoccupations and little else, he says.